All right, let's talk briefly, before we start talking about the pump itself, let's talk about balloon pumping in general, 10,000 foot view. What exactly are we trying to accomplish with an intra-aortic balloon pump? And just so you know, we celebrated 50 years of balloon pumping last month. 50 years. This is probably the oldest machine in the hospital, relatively speaking, right? 50 years. And Arrow has been on the forefront. We actually are the R&D company. We started this. We started and created fiber optic technology. We created automaticity and now the wave algorithm, which I'll touch on in a minute. 10,000 foot view. Balloon pumping is inflating and deflating this intra-aortic balloon catheter inside the descending aorta, in and out. But we want to make sure that we're inflating and deflating this balloon at the right time. It's all about timing. We want to make sure that we're inflating when the heart's not contracting and pushing blood this way. We need to make sure there's this synchronicity, all right? And to do that, we need a proper trigger. It's all about triggering and timing. Arrow uses what's called the Win-Kessel aortic valve equation, which is intra-beat diacrotic notch prediction algorithm. We're capturing the diacrotic notch on every single heartbeat. That's unique to us. It's a patented algorithm. We do not take what's called predictive timing, which is capturing the last 20 beats and inflating on that 21st beat. Imagine if you have, normal sinus and then a run and normal sinus again. Well, how do you inflate properly here? Well, you can't. You get about a 25% accuracy rate. With Arrow and our wave algorithm, it's 98.1% accurate for your most arrhythmic patients, even patients with heart rates up to 200. So imagine a fast arrhythmic patient, 98.1% accurate. And for normal sinus, 99% accurate. That's why Harvard and Baylor and Stanford and UPMC and UCLA, and I can go on and on and on, use Arrow because they get it. They get that technology. The predictive algorithm is technology that we abandoned over 12 years ago. So it's important that everyone understands that this is a very, very high-tech, well-documented, white-papered technological algorithm, but super easy to use. All right, so let's get into the ease of use now. We make sure that the pump is always plugged in 24/7 inside of your transport vehicles into your inverter. We have a battery. Your battery is a 90-minute battery. Down here you'll notice that the green light indicates that it is plugged in, and the yellow light indicates the battery is fully charged at 80% or higher. Here is my main power switch powering on the pump. In a STEMI, you don't necessarily have to have your ECG connected or your transducer connected. You can utilize the fiber optic catheter. This sensor at the tip is a high fidelity AP signal. So for STEMI patients, you get the catheter in the patient, we've handed off the fiber optic that's connected, and you're off and running. However, for regular patients, we want to make sure that we have our patient connections. Here's my ECG connection here. Here's my transducer connection here. Green for ECG and orange for your AP. All right, this is my simulator, so you guys can disregard this piece, but this is my simulator, and I'm going to simulate my ECG and my AP waveform. There it is right here. So I've connected my patient's ECG right there. So now I'm going to make my patient connections. I've got the catheter into the patient. I've made my fiber optic connection. This is my helium connection right here. So I've powered it on. I've made my patient connections. And now all I need to do is hit the on button, power on to the patient. All right.
And that on button was where?
Right here, on.
Right, okay.
All right. This is my standby button. If I push standby, it will stop pumping. However, in 3 minutes, it'll alarm and say, please, start me again. So it is a nice little fail-safe. We do not want to use the off button because then it will not alarm in 3 minutes, but you can use this if you're ready to DC the catheter. All right, let's talk about autopilot. You always want to be in autopilot, never ever in operator mode. Autopilot, 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 because in operator mode, your patient will not, or the pump will not, find the proper trigger for your patient. Right now, I'm in a pattern trigger. If my patient were to become tachycardic, it instantly switches to a peak trigger. If my patient were to have some type of arrhythmia, the pump has this arrhythmia timing that is always on, and if an arrhythmia did happen, for instance right there, you'll see, oh yes, arrhythmia detected. And so now it's going to circulate through the different triggering mechanisms and eventually end up on an AFib trigger. Again, only in autopilot. All right? Your AP select button will always say fiber optic if you're utilizing a fiber optic catheter. If you're not using fiber optic, then it'll be on the transducer. Mine is on monitor because I'm using a simulator. But again, you'll be on fiber optic or transducer. Your ECG will also say skin and not monitor. Again, I'm using a simulator, but yours will say skin lead. Again, here are your triggers right over here, your arrhythmia timing. This is your cursor button. Let's talk about proper balloon sizing. On your balloon box, you'll notice you have a 30, a 40, or a 50 cc catheter based on height and body mass. 4'10" to 5'4" is a 30, 5'4" to 6 foot, and above 6 foot, including body masses. But again, these are very subjective sizing strategies. On the Arrow balloon pump, you can actually adjust per each individual patient. To do that, I bring my cursor down and I drop that down onto this balloon pressure waveform, and I drop it onto the chair of that balloon pressure waveform right here, and I get a corresponding pressure reading of 126. I want that number to be as close as possible to my patient's augmentation pressure. 126 and 117, those are pretty close. I actually have a range I can work within, 25 above and 25 below my augmentation. So right now I'm within that range. However, if I drop that cursor down onto this plateau pressure that was up here, I'm outside of that range, 181 versus 126. It means I have too much pressure on that balloon. If you recall, I only want to occlude that lumen to about 85%. Anything tighter than that, and I may be hitting the inside of that lumen. I certainly don't want it to be too small because I'm not giving them any augmentation, any therapy. So if my cursor comes down onto a number that's outside of that range, I need to go to balloon volume and decrease volume out of that balloon. Let me do that again. I hit balloon volume, I decrease it down in 0.5 increments. Let's take it down to a 36.5. I hit the apply button. My pump adjusts and now pushes in only 36.5 cc's, and I can bring that cursor down to that new plateau, 117, 126. Looks like I'm just about right. All right, so there you go. New pressure readings. Tomorrow, when the patient's in ICU, that cursor may be down in here, which means my balloon is not big enough now. And so I can go to balloon volume and jump it up to full volume and hit the apply button and bring it up from 36.5 right back up to 40, and then bring my cursor back to that new plateau pressure. All right? Let's talk about our pressure readings over here. I'm in a 1-to-1 ratio, and I have all of these pressure readings over here are assisted, which makes sense. If I jump to a 1-to-2 ratio, I now have two sets of numbers. My big white numbers are my assisted pressures, and my little yellow numbers are my patient's actual pressures. And sure enough, my diastolic is 71 versus 60, and systolic 111 versus 107, which is exactly what balloon pumping is. It is not only more perfusion, but it's also that afterload effect, the pressure drop. So these are exactly what I want to see, and then I can go back to that 1-to-1 ratio. All right. Let's talk about what happens during a code. If my patient were to code and it goes asystole, my triggering mechanism instantly jumps to AP, which is arterial pressure. Arterial pressure is just that. It's chest compressions. So on my catheter, my sensor sits right here next to my heart. And as I'm compressing down, it hits the sensor, which triggers at the speed of light. And so regardless of how erratic my compressions are, I'm still getting proper inflation and deflation with the pump on. In autopilot in a 1-to-1 ratio, I'm getting 70% more perfusion with each compression. So it's like having two people on top of this guy. Always leave the pump on during a code. The patient, or when the patient comes back and I get an ECG trigger back on my patient, you'll notice that it will not trigger back off of an ECG for about 3 minutes. It'll stay in an AP trigger because the pump is intuitive enough to know that your patients don't always necessarily come back on the very first try. All right, so we talked about some of the buttons, we talked about assessing the patient, we talked about balloon volume delivery. Let's talk about best signal analysis. In the background of the pump, there is what we call best signal analysis, which means it's always capturing the right ECG. If you happen to lose a lead off of the patient without the pump stopping therapy or interrupting therapy, it instantly jumps to the next best lead. It doesn't have to go circle back around. It instantly jumps to the next best lead. And you may get a visual alarm. You won't get an audible alarm. But what it's telling you is, hey, you just lead loss. But it's nice because it does not interrupt therapy. Again, best signal analysis is also your triggering mechanism as well. The last thing I want to touch on is helium. This is your helium gauge right here, measuring a full tank, which is 500 psi. As this depletes down, it'll change color. When it changes color, it's time to change the helium tank. On the side of your tank, while you're pumping, even in flight, you can open up your door here. You do not have to mess with any of the valves. Unlock, lift out your tank, unscrew your tank. Again, you can see that it did not interrupt any therapy. Now it will alarm and say beep, beep, beep. I don't have any helium. Yes, I know. There it is. Grab my new tank, take my cap off, and screw the new tank right back in again. So the whole thing takes, less than 10
And then there's a humidity thing hiding behind there.
Underneath here is a little condensation trap. You can just pull this little canister out and dump this out if you find any condensation buildup. We just like to keep condensation out of the mechanism, but here at high altitude it's very rare that we have that. And then just plug that right back in and close it down. Lock it, shut it. No adjustments are needed for in flight. The pump automatically adjusts to altitude, so there's no need to make any adjustments. You're not going to get pressure alarms or anything like that or anything, so it's very unique, very, very transport friendly. In fact, you can lay this pump down, you can turn it upside down. It has what's called a stepper bellows mechanism, just like your bellows on your fireplace. It is not gravity driven, and so you can just lay it down if you need to do that. Your monitor does come off if you choose to lay the pump down and use something. You can unravel this. Your monitor does come off.
Are you just pinching the top of that to activate that?
Pinch that. It's got a little lock here, so it won't fall off. But if I pinch this, it unlocks it, just like that.
Okay.
All right. It has handles on the base, that are folded down during regular operation. If you want to pull those out, you can. There's one on each side to help lift the pump. It weighs, about 100 pounds, and it's actually, I've lifted up all the time and put it in the trunk of my car. Right, it's not that hard. I do it by myself.
Okay.
Yep.
Power button is the green there.
Correct. Here on the side of the blue bag, which is your bag that holds the helium, you'll notice a 1-800 number right here. This is a 24-hour hotline answered by nurses. It's a direct connect. It's not a callback. So you get connected instantly to a nurse, and you can walk through any troubleshooting that you may have.
And the contents of the bag are usually what?
Usually inside of that bag are your spare helium. You'll also perhaps have your transducer set, your pressure bag, and your tubing. This is extra monitoring cables to hook up to in ICU, but that's usually about it. So transducer and have your monitor can telescope up and down for transport. If you wanted to take this all the way down, you could. Again, we talked about taking the monitor off. It also rotates with a button in the back. It does a full 360 rotation. Lift it up away from my monitor, but it does a full 360. Let's talk about printing a strip. When you do have an alarm, let's talk about that very quickly. One of the most common alarms is what's called helium loss alarm. You'll notice my balloon pressure waveform is no longer a chair, but is squared off into a building. My reset button turns my alarm off. But you'll notice that the first thing under my high pressure alarm, the first thing on my laundry list to look at is a kink catheter. So perhaps my patient has leaned forward, they've lifted their leg, perhaps the helium tubing is trapped under a wheel or someone's stepping on it, but it allows you to troubleshoot and look for what may be causing the problem, fix the problem, and then go back to the on button. You'll notice you did get a strip printed off with every alarm. If you needed an extra strip, you can hit the recorder on. Just remember, when you hit recorder on, you also need to hit it off again, or it will just keep running and running and running. But here's my strip that I just printed off right here. Let's talk briefly about my pressures here. I'm going to go briefly to a 1-to-2 ratio. And we'll look at assisted versus unassisted pressure readings. Again, we talked about your systolic versus your diastolic, assisted versus unassisted, but on your AP waveform, right? We want to make sure that in your mountains here and your valleys, right, that your assisted systolic pressures, right, your assisted systolic are lower than your patient systolic, and your assisted diastolic pressures, right, are lower than your actual patient diastolic pressures.
Can you pause the screen?
You sure can. So if I hit display freeze, right there, this is your patient's diastolic, your patient's systolic, your augmentation. Here is your assisted diastolic pressures. Remember, we want that to be lower than your patient diastolic. Here is your assisted systolic pressures. Again, we want that to be lower than your patient systolic, which it is, right? And here's your diacrotic notch. So patient diastolic, patient assisted, augmentation. Here's your assisted diastolic and assisted systolic. So when you're transducing and need to zero your transducer, your AP select should always be on transducer, and then you'll have this bottom button here, zero transducer. You can push that and then open up your stopcock, right, and zero it to the atmosphere, and you're good to go. And again, it'll always be on transducer. If you're using the fiber optic, then there's no need because your fiber optic connection is always zeroed automatically.
So for transport, for CPR purposes, no need to manually mess with the trigger.
That's right.
Because it'll select pressure automatically for CPR.
Yep. I also.
And what if you get ROSC in your back, and will it find its trigger back to where it belongs?
So what I suggest then is to pull your ECG cable out, because when you pull your ECG cable out, it'll automatically switch to an AP trigger, right? Just leave it off, right? Because you're okay signaling off of an arterial pressure waveform, right? Certainly during compressions. And then when your patient comes back, your fiber optic is a high fidelity AP. Now, if you feel like you're okay to, reconnect, then you can certainly reconnect your ECG cable and get your waveform back. But yes, you can trigger just as effectively off of an AP signal.
Okay.
So inside of every catheter box, you'll find this helium adapter tubing. You'll notice it says data scope. We, Arrow, include one on top in every single catheter box. This goes with transport if you're transporting with an Arrow catheter to a facility that does not use an Arrow pump. All right, if you're transporting out of here, which you guys don't, because everyone here uses Arrow. However, this can also be used for your pump that's upstairs, your CS300, right? An Arrow catheter on that pump.
Excellent.
So there's your adapter tubing, and there's your adapter right there.